The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 2. Hatred's Final Solution. One of the most remarkable prophecies in the Bible is found in the many declarations that Jews would be scattered to all nations, where they would be hated, persecuted, and killed like no other people. These prophecies are specific and vivid, describing in detail the plight of the Jews exactly as it has befallen them through the many centuries of their dispersion. God pronounced this severe judgment because of Israel's disobedience and idolatry after being brought into the Promised Land, and He foretold it in numerous prophecies. This prophesied judgment has been fulfilled consistently throughout Jewish history, and after 3,000 years is still being fulfilled today with a vengeance. What must it be like to be a part of a people group that is hated and maligned worldwide, with so many lies told about them that it would be impossible to answer them all, and would do little good to try? It would be maddening, frustrating, and, yes, frightening. Hitler did not act alone in the Holocaust by any means, as we shall see, but with the consent and cooperation of other world powers, including the United States. More than 100 official anti-Semitic documents have been issued by the Roman Catholic Church throughout its history. The knights and knaves who constituted the First Crusade, inspired by Pope Urban II, who promised heaven to those who died in this cause, slaughtered Jews all across Europe. When they took Jerusalem, they drove the Jews into the synagogue and set it ablaze. Centuries of Jew hatred inspired by the Roman Catholic Church, wherever it was in power, helped to prepare the way for Hitler's Holocaust. Pope John Paul II tried to woo the Jews worldwide by his kindly but deceitful rhetoric. He even told them that Catholics, quote, "look upon you as our brothers and sisters in the Lord," end quote. Hardly compatible with Paul's desire that they, the Jews, might be saved, Romans 10, verse 1. There was no way, however, that the Pope could undo centuries of his church's hatred and mistreatment of Jews. Such sweet phrases are not only inconsistent with history and official church doctrine, but they were contradicted by his friendship with Arafat. John Paul II consistently favored the Palestinians in their false claims, nor did he ever affirm Israelis' biblical right to the land God gave them. In fact, like popes and cardinals before him, he openly denied that right. Quote, "The existence of the State of Israel and its political options should be envisaged not in a perspective which is in itself religious, but in their reference to the common principles of international law." End quote. So the opinion of secular world leaders overrides God's word. Martin Luther never escaped the anti-Semitism of his Roman Catholic past in spite of opposing that church. In his later life, he advocated burning down the Jews' homes and giving them the choice between converting or having their tongues torn out. Luther's anger against the Jews was inexcusable, even though it grew out of a deep-seated frustration that they would not respond to the gospel he had embraced. In an interview on September 25, 2001, Israel's former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed that terrorists don't hate America because of Israel, they hate Israel as an extension of America. As an Israeli, he should be the expert on that subject. Perhaps he had forgotten, however, that Hitler did not hate Jews because of America, nor did the Tsars of Russia, nor the popes, nor have Muslims throughout 1,300 years of history hated Jews for that reason. A blatant anti-Semitism has persisted from Israel's very beginning and is awakening again worldwide as foretold. Irrational Jew hatred is pervasive. The frequent condemnations of Israel by the UN and EU for defending herself against deadly attacks by those determined to exterminate her, and the refusal to condemn the murderers and their backers who attack her, are only one part of a continuing fulfillment of numerous prophecies, foretelling worldwide anti-Semitism. This is a major and irrefutable proof of the existence of the one true God, and the fact that the Bible is His infallible word. The hatred did not end with Hitler's Holocaust, but is actually escalating once again. It is a taunting mocking of 6 million exterminated Jews. That escalation has been in progress for many years. Desecration of the graves and even the bodies of Jews has been going on periodically in France for 2 decades, in a resurgence of anti-Semitism throughout Europe. In Russia, in 1990, Pamyat, an anti-Semitic organization, called for a new, final solution to the Jewish problem, and prophesied that Russia would be the one to eliminate the evil of world Jewry. The rising hatred against Jews in Eastern Europe is especially perverse in view of the fact that out of about 5 million Jews in that area in the 1930s, there remain only some 25,000 today. In 1989, the Polish Catholic primate, Cardinal Joseph Glemp, accused Jewish survivors of the Holocaust of introducing communism into Poland and introducing vodka. It was said that he spoke for the vast majority of Catholics in Poland. In post-Ceausescu Romania, it quickly became apparent that it was better for one's political career to have a Nazi background than a Jewish one. In September 1993, the body of Nicholas Horthy, Hitler's friend who allied Hungary with Nazi Germany during the war and presided over the deportation of 437,000 Jews to Auschwitz, was reburied with high honors in his hometown 80 miles east of Budapest. About 50,000 people gathered as the remains of Horthy, his wife and son, were placed in a family vault. The Prime Minister and his ministers honored Horthy in speeches and attended the ceremony, which was broadcast over state television. A Eurobarometer opinion poll late in 2003 questioned 500 persons from each European Union nation. 59% overall, 74% in the Netherlands, considered Israel to be the greatest threat to peace of any country in the world. In stark contrast, at about the same time, Americans ranked Israel as the 10th greatest threat to world peace. Outraged at being called by Europeans a greater threat to peace than terrorist nations such as Iran, Syria, and North Korea, Israel's mission to the EU nevertheless did not blame European citizens, but those who are responsible for forming public opinion. It said that the poll reflected the impact of distorted media coverage of the Middle East conflict. The Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, a Jewish rights group, said the survey shows that anti-Semitism is deeply embedded within European society, and Israel should exclude the EU from any future Middle East peace process. But how can Israel dictate to Europe, upon whose goodwill much of its exports depend? Not only is media coverage of today's events distorted, but the history being taught in public schools is often deficient by design. A poll in January 2005 revealed that 45% of Britons and 60% of those under 35 years of age had never heard of Auschwitz, while 34% polled in Italy believed that Jews secretly control financial and economic powers as well as the media. In spite of gross ignorance of the facts, people develop firm opinions and prejudices based upon the misinformation they imbibe from the media. It is here that we see the influence of a pervasive and persistent anti-Semitism. More than 2,000 adults across Britain were polled in December 2004 concerning their opinions about some 24 countries. Israel was rated the country most Britons would least like to visit, the least deserving of international respect, and the least democratic, though it is the only democracy in the Middle East. During December 2004 and January 2005, the official Iranian news agency MEHR published a series of anti-Semitic articles. Two leading Holocaust deniers were quoted. Dr. Frederick Tobin of the Adelaide Institute in Australia, claiming that the State of Israel is founded on the Holocaust lie. Exposing the lie would help dismantle the Zionist entity. And Professor Robert Forisson of France, referring to the, quote, alleged Holocaust of the Jews, end quote. In a review of the movie Exodus, Mojtaba Habibi accused the Jews, of all things, of collaboration with the Nazis and of orchestrating a grand scheme of world dominion together with Joseph Stalin. They could just as truthfully claim that about Mickey Mouse. On Iran's TV Channel 1, Professor Heshmatullah Kanbari described Jews as satanic and anti-human, dangerous to both Christians and Muslims, the source of all corrupt traits in humanity, coveting and usurping other nations. Several anti-Semitic TV drama series were also being aired on Iranian TV. Such lies about Jews are exactly what multitudes love to believe. Hatred at the highest levels. Unreasonable and persistent animosity toward Jews and Israel is not confined to the ignorant and uneducated. One would expect the United Nations, with its supposed strong stand for the rights of all people, to be a leader in dispelling anti-Semitism. Instead, it has been a bastion of Jew hatred, systematically singling out Israel for punitive treatment while at the same time embracing terrorist nations with never a rebuke. Incredibly, Zionism, the belief that Jews, like the rest of the world, have a right to their own national homeland, was condemned as racism by UN General Assembly Resolution 3379 on November 10, 1975. 16 long years later, December 16, 1991, that vote was finally reversed over Muslim protest. Zionism, however, continued to be a capital crime in Iraq. The UN Commission on Human Rights discriminates against Israel before it even votes. That lone democracy in the Middle East is the one UN member excluded from this commission. At its March and April 2004 meeting, about 25% of the debates were dedicated to attacking Israel. And out of the Commission's 10 country-specific resolutions, 5 targeted Israel. During the 6-week session, while 190 countries met for vital consultation within their regional groups, the Israeli representative was literally left standing alone in the corridor. There was only one emergency meeting during the 2004 session, not for the million-plus victims of Darfur who were virtually ignored, but to condemn Israel for killing Ahmed Yassin, head of the Hamas terrorist group. On a leading Russian TV program, Vremya, one of Russia's most distinguished mathematicians, Igor R. Shafarevich, expressed support for Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War. In 1990, a group of anti-Semitic Russian writers traveled throughout the U.S., some of whom had signed the infamous Letter of 74 Writers. Shafarevich was one of its authors, which expressed support for the Muslim Brothers in the Gulf War, and was widely quoted in the American press. One newspaper covered it with a headline, quote, "Thanks to Iraq for bombarding Israel. The kikes deserve it." End quote. Although anti-Semitism is growing in the United States, especially on university campuses, this country remains one of the few in which leaders speak out against it. In July 1992, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences asked Shafarevich to resign. He refused. G.K. Gonzalez, chairman of the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Committee on Scientific Freedom and Responsibility, wrote to Shafarevich, "We wish to express repugnance at and condemnation of your anti-Semitic writings. Your prestige as an eminent mathematician gives credence and special weight to your singling out one group for special opprobrium. The committee finds it regrettable that a mathematician of your stature has disseminated such unfounded and vile characterizations in your writings." At its annual winter meeting, January 12, 1993, the American Mathematical Society passed a resolution condemning the anti-Semitic writings of I.R. Shafarevich, who has used his highly respected position as an eminent mathematician to give special weight to his words of hatred, which are contrary to fundamental standards of human decency and to the spirit of mathematics and science. Such protests, however, are rare and, in fulfillment of Bible prophecy, have little effect in stemming the rising tide of anti-Semitism. A letter dated January 13, 2005, carrying the Russian parliament's letterhead, called on Russia's prosecutor general to officially open a legal investigation into banning all Jewish religious and community groups on grounds of defense of the homeland. Using some of the most profane language against Jews publicly published in the post-Soviet era, the 7-page letter, which described Jewish beliefs as nothing less than Satanism, was signed by 20 members of the 450-seat State Duma lower house of parliament. Andrei Cherkasov, one of Moscow's most noted Jewish commentators, declared, "I can tell you this with absolute certainty. However you try to cover up anti-Semitism, its naked feet will still be sticking out." A U.S. State Department report to the Senate and House Foreign Relations Committees covering the period July 2003 through December 2004 warned that in Europe, where anti-Semitism is already deeply rooted, anti-Semitic acts have increased, both in frequency and severity, since 2000, with the increase in the Muslim population from immigration. There is an increase of anti-Semitic sentiment across the Muslim world, even in places like Pakistan, where there are no Jews. This is a new phenomenon. According to the report, the stereotype of Jews as manipulators of the global economy continues to provide fertile grounds for anti-Semitic aggression. Although only about 1% of Japanese have ever had any contact with a Jewish person, anti-Semitism in Japan is deeply rooted, is of long standing. Anti-Semitic books have been popular in Japan for at least 100 years, and is growing. Best-selling books in Japan blame Jews for every disaster, from earthquakes to the stock market crash of 1993. Such was the message of an ad covering 1/3 of a page in the newspaper Nihon Kizashi, Japan's equivalent of the Wall Street Journal. It even claimed that Jews controlled Japan's finance ministry and the Bank of Japan. The paper rejected a call for a retraction or apology by the Simon Wiesenthal Center. There is no rational explanation for this continuous animosity toward a particular people. It cannot be justified by saying that Jews, in contrast to all others, are so despicable that they deserve to be hated. Yet this irrational and implacable anti-Semitism is exactly what biblical prophets foretold. That fact provides another major proof that the Bible is God's Word. And there are no Jew haters as vicious as the Muslims, who didn't even exist when these prophecies were written. Islamic persecutions. Ever since the Muslim conquest of the Middle East in the 7th century, Jews have suffered in Muslim lands from inhumane treatment and periodic bursts of deadly violence. Take only one country, Morocco, as an example of what occurred everywhere under Islam. Jews were forced to live in ghettos called melas. One historian writes that incidents of rape, looting, burning of synagogues, destruction of Torah scrolls, and murder were so frequent that it is impossible to list them. In A.D. 1032, in Fez, about 6,000 Jews were murdered, and many more robbed of their women and property. In 1066, after Islam took over Spain, the Jews of Granada were massacred. That fate periodically overtook those who would not submit to Allah, even though Islam promises Jews and Christians, described in the Quran as people of the book, protection as dhimmis, that is, fifth-class citizens subject to heavy taxation and cultural humiliation. The dhimmis were not to be killed, but often their lives were so unbearable, living under protection of Muslims, that death would have been preferable. In the early 17th century, Christian visitors to Palestine declared, "Life here is the poorest and most miserable that one can imagine. As dhimmis, the Jews pay for the very air they breathe." Yet many thousands of Jews, though periodically wiped out by pogroms or driven out, managed in desperation somehow to cling to the land God had given them in Hebron as elsewhere. The fierce persecution of 1640, in which even women and children were murdered, was called the Al-Qada. Under Muslims, Jews suffered such repression, restriction, and humiliation as to exceed anything in Europe. Continuing that tradition, although there were no Jews in his country and none are allowed to enter to this day, Saudi Arabia's King Ibn Saud said for a Muslim to kill a Jew ensures him an immediate entry into heaven. Diabolical but persuasive motivation indeed. This is not the declaration of an extremist. This is Islam. If not, why has the mayhem continued for centuries without significant opposition from religious leaders or the Muslim masses? In 1839, a British visitor to Palestine declared, "What the Jew has to endure at all hands is not to be told." A Jewish visitor to Palestine in 1847 reported that Jews do not have any protection and are at the mercy of policemen and the pashas who treat them as they wish. Their property is not at their disposal, and they dare not complain about an injury for fear of the Arabs' revenge. Their lives are precarious and subject to daily danger of death. Scores of incidents involving anti-Jewish violence, persecution, and extortion filled page after page of documented reports from the British consulate in Jerusalem. We lack space to give further evidence of continued Islamic persecution of Jews throughout history. Such persecution has continued against those few thousand Jews who failed to escape Muslim lands. In 1941, hundreds of Jews were viciously tortured and murdered by Iraqi mobs in anti-British pro-Nazi riots led by Haj Amin Mohammed Effendi al-Husseini, appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem by the British, but who had been forced to flee to Syria for his instigation of riots that had killed and wounded hundreds of Jews, as well as Arabs who wanted to live peacefully with Jews. Having moved on to Iraq, he was doing more of the same and finding great sympathy among the Muslim masses. Police watched passively as Jewish homes and businesses were looted and synagogues desecrated. Years later, when Saddam Hussein became a leader in the Ba'ath Party, he published one of his Jew-hating uncle Kairala's pamphlets, 3 Things Allah Should Not Have Created: Persians, Jews, and Flies. In a letter dated July 10, 1974, to then UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark declared, "Jewish people living in Syria today are subjected to the most pervasive and inhuman persecution. Young women and children are harassed in the streets. Old people are knocked down. Homes are stoned. They are forbidden to leave in peace and cannot remain in dignity. Many have been arrested, detained, tortured, and killed. Ironically, in late December 2004, Ramsey Clark signed on as part of the legal team that would defend Saddam Hussein in his trial in Iraq. Anti-Semitism is not confined to Muslims and Catholics. It is worldwide. The fact that vicious anti-Semitism would pursue the Jews everywhere throughout history is only one, but a very important one, of the many prophecies being fulfilled today concerning Israel that God points to as proof that He is the one true God, that the Bible is His Word, and that the Jews are His chosen people. A pair of researchers, not evangelical Christians by any means, who have probably done more than anyone else to document modern anti-Semitism, write in their must-be-read book, quote, "For more than 20 centuries, the Jewish people, more than any other segment of humanity, have been persecuted, uprooted, and annihilated. It is true that many ethnic and religious groups have suffered grievously at the hands of tyrants, but there is a crucial difference. More Africans were killed in the era of slavery. But there was no determined intent to eradicate the entire Negro race. A higher percentage of Armenians perished in the Turkish genocide before World War I. But the main intent was to deport them, not extinguish their genetic pool. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and Suharto murdered millions of their own citizens, but the motive for these crimes was political power, not racial animus. In each of these cases, the genocide was intended to serve a deeper purpose: the conquest of territory, the acquisition of wealth, the enlargement of political power. In contrast, the genocide of the Jewish people was not intended to be a means to an end. It was not attempted in order to achieve a more fundamental purpose. It was the fundamental purpose. This is what makes the Nazi Holocaust unique in human history." End quote. Brilliant as these researchers are, and as invaluable as the information they have passed along, they have a blind spot when it comes to Islam. Nowhere in their monumental work of more than 650 pages do they tell us the vital truth that Islam itself, not some extremist, requires that every Jew in the world must be killed. Nor do they inform us that Islam has been responsible for the slaughter and subjugation of far more people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, than any other evil empire. And that, according to Muhammad, it must take over the entire world. The horrible truth about Islam, which these authors completely overlook, is still being denied by religious and political leaders, educators, and the media today. To fill that vacuum and to expose the truth about Islam before it is too late is a major purpose of this volume. Why must the Jews, this one very small ethnic group, in contrast to all others, be the universal object of such relentless hatred? Only the Bible gives a satisfactory explanation. Hatred's final solution. In fallen creation's long and sordid history of man's inhumanity to man, the Nazi Holocaust was a close second to Islam. Hitler declared that the final objective of rational anti-Semitism must be the removal of Jews altogether. It is no surprise, then, that to most Muslims, especially those living in Muslim nations, Hitler is one of their greatest heroes. Mein Kampf in Arabic remains a perpetual bestseller in Muslim countries, especially among Palestinians. Hitler was, in fact, a partner with Haj Ahmed Mohammed Effendi al-Husseini, great-uncle and mentor of Yasser Arafat, and still a hero to Muslims, a murderous terrorist, appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem by Britain and personally responsible for the concentration camp slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Jews. On November 21, 1941, Hitler promised the Mufti a solution to the Jewish problem in exchange for al-Husseini's recruitment of thousands of Arabs to fight with Hitler. Based on years of careful investigation, Joan Peters writes, quote, according to documentary records submitted to the United Nations in 1947, al-Husseini was responsible for the Arab riots in 1920 against Jewish lives and property. 5 Jews were killed and 211 injured on Easter Sunday alone. The Arab police remained passive or, in some instances, joined the rioting. British officer R. Meinertzagen reported later that Haj Amin had been informed by British Colonel Waters Taylor 4 days before that he had a great opportunity at Easter to show the world that the Arabs of Palestine would not tolerate Jewish dominance, that Palestine was unpopular with the British, and if disturbances of sufficient violence occurred in Jerusalem at Easter, both General Bowles and General Allenby would advocate the abandonment of the Jewish home. Colonel Meinertzagen, a senior British officer, a non-Jew, was charged with being pro-Zionist and sent back to a desk job in London, where he later protested British policy against the Jews. Quote, much has been written about injustice to Arabs. There is nothing in a Jewish state which conflicts with Arab rights. Remember that the Arabs are the only nation in the world with at least 3 kings and several sovereign states. The Jews are a nation without a home. End quote. Hitler and Husseini pledged to work together to exterminate Jews not only in Europe but in the Middle East as well. The Mufti tried to set up a Nazi puppet regime in Iraq. When that rebellion failed, he escaped to Tehran, from there to Rome, and then to Berlin. During the 3.5 years, October 1941 to May of 1945, of serving the Axis, he built up a truly worldwide network of anti-Allied activities, including broadcasting, espionage, and formation of Arab and Muslim military units. After the collapse of the Third Reich, he escaped once more to Cairo, where he was greeted by the entire Arab leadership as the greatest Arab patriot and hero. Egyptian newspaper columnist Ahmad Rajab, echoing Anwar Sadat, wrote, thanks to Hitler, blessed memory. We do have a complaint. His revenge on the Jews was not enough. At the same time, much of the Muslim world attempts to deny the Holocaust. Dr. Issam Sisalam of the University of Gaza declared they are all lies. No Dachau, no Auschwitz. The Holocaust was against our people. Sheikh Ibrahim Mahdi vowed in a sermon, Allah willing, Israel will be erased. At the Wannsee Conference in Germany, January 20th, 1942, 15 Nazi officials met to discuss the final solution to the Jewish problem. They enthusiastically and without any conscience plotted the extermination of the 11 million Jews they had identified in Europe and Russia. The conference was convened and chaired by SS General Reinhard Heydrich and followed the protocol written 2 years earlier by SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann. About 500,000 Jews had already been killed by various means, but the gassing of Jews by mobile vans, which had begun December 8, 1941, had proven too slow and inefficient. Eichmann confessed that at Wannsee they spoke about methods of killing, about liquidation, about extermination. Hitler and his Nazi henchmen did not act alone. They could not have carried out the Holocaust without the cooperation of the German people as a whole. Nor do Hitler and Germany bear sole responsibility for the Holocaust. Many other governments share in this guilt as well. The world refused to be stirred by the horror of what it knew was happening, much less to do anything significant about it. A guilt shared by the world. The United States government had full knowledge from reliable intelligence of the extermination of the Jews at least as early as August of 1942. The State Department, which remains firmly anti-Israel to this day, deliberately suppressed the information and, incredible as it may seem, actively worked to prevent the rescue of Jews. Dated February 10, 1943, State Department Telegram 354 shut down the secret channels of communication with informants and indicated that further information about the extermination of Jews was of no interest and should not be accepted in diplomatic channels. At meetings with British and American leaders, including the British War Cabinet, Foreign Minister Anthony Eden, President Roosevelt, Secretary of State Hull, Secretary of War Stimson, Attorney General Biddle, and Justice Frankfurter, Jan Karski, who had visited the Warsaw Ghetto and talked with Jewish resistance leaders, offered shocking statistics of the ongoing efforts to exterminate Europe's Jews. Karski's revelations about the systematic slaughter of Jews by the Nazis appeared in the New York Times and other major periodicals. He lectured on the subject diligently all across America, and his book, Story of a Secret State, became a Book of the Month Club selection and was published simultaneously in Britain, France, Switzerland, and Sweden. In the end, Karski's disappointed and frustrated comment was, "The Lord assigned me a role to speak and write during the war, when it seemed to me it might help. It did not. And sadly, attempts to warn of today's even more destructive Islamic threat to wipe out all Jews in the world and to conquer the world for Allah seem likewise to fall on deaf ears." It was not until January 16, 1944, at the urging of a minor official who presented to him once more the staggering information already known, that Morgenthau persuaded Roosevelt to take action. The motive, however, was not to rescue Jews from Hitler's ovens, but to defer political criticism that could hurt him in the upcoming elections and his bid for an unprecedented fourth term. The War Refugee Board was formed, but its efforts were too little and too late. American journalist Dorothy Thompson wrote in Hitler's day, "It is a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death." And even the proper piece of paper proved worthless as the bloodlust reached new heights worldwide. The ocean liner St. Louis reached Havana May 27, 1939, with 930 passengers fleeing from Nazi Germany, who possessed valid permits to land in Cuba. The Cuban government changed its mind, refused to honor the visas, and demanded $500,000 per person, then raised the price to $1 million each. Of course, that was impossible. The price was eventually reduced, but remained beyond reach of Jewish would-be benefactors by the heartless deadline set. To its everlasting shame, the United States, too, rejected the pleas of Captain Gustav Schroeder to take in his passengers. Eventually, they all found refuge in England, Belgium, France, and Holland. But only the 288 taken in by England and very few of the others escaped the Holocaust. The bald hypocrisy of world powers. The die had already been cast a year earlier at the conference held at the luxurious Hotel Royal in Evian, France, on the shores of Lake Geneva, where delegates from 32 countries gathered to discuss the worsening plight of the Jews. Though President Roosevelt had called the conference, from the beginning he made it clear that the United States would do nothing. Britain said there was no room in Palestine for Jews beyond the cruel quota its white paper of 1939 would set of 10,000 per year, to be ended altogether in 5 years, and insisted that Palestine was not to be discussed. In addition, Britain generously would allow, over the same period of 5 years, 25,000 refugees from Nazi Germany to enter. Considering the fact that the Nazis had identified 11 million Jews for extermination, this quota was an insult to common sense, compassion, and conscience. At the same time, Britain was closing its eyes to and even aiding the influx of many thousands of Arabs, who would later claim to be Palestinians, descended from the original inhabitants, and to have been there since time immemorial. The United Nations would consider Arabs who had been there at least 2 years to be original inhabitants, but would not apply the same standard to Jews. The only purpose of the Evian Conference, other than sailing, riding, summer snow skiing at Chamonix on Mount Blanc, mineral baths, and gambling, which the delegates enjoyed to the fullest, seemed to be to give the nations a forum to hypocritically profess their great sympathy for Europe's Jews, who the whole world knew were facing extinction, and then to present various excuses for their inability to do anything to intervene in their ongoing extermination. And what an opportunity the conference gave Hitler, like Pilate, to wash his hands of guilt and to show that the entire world was his partner in destroying the Jews. 2 days after Roosevelt announced the Evian Conference, Hitler shrewdly declared, "I can only hope that the other world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals, Jews, will at least be generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries, for all I care, even on luxury ships." When the conference ended as it began, with nothing for the Jews, Hitler mocked the participants. Quote, "Since in many countries it was recently regarded as wholly incomprehensible why Germany did not wish to preserve in its population an element like the Jews, it appears astounding that countries seem in no way anxious to make use of these elements themselves, now that the opportunity offers." End quote. No one called Hitler's bluff, if that's what it was. No one can blame Hitler for the Holocaust, not when he offered to let the Jews go, and no nation was willing to open its arms and receive them. Later in the war, desperate for cash, he would offer to sell 500,000 Hungarian Jews for $2 each, and no one would offer to ransom them from death even at that bargain price. There was no need for millions of Jews to perish in Hitler's ovens. It happened simply because world leaders did not value Jews as human beings enough to accept them. In April 1943, British and American officials met in Bermuda to discuss the Holocaust, which was grinding out its daily quota of victims, now in the millions. Once again, it was formally decided to do nothing. Finally, the reason for the inaction at Evian 5 years earlier was openly admitted, at least among the delegates. The emerging picture unveils the truth about the evil in the human heart and makes one ashamed to be part of the human race. The British Foreign Office and the U.S. State Department were both afraid that the Third Reich would be quite willing, indeed eager, to stop the gas chambers, empty the concentration camps, and let hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jewish survivors emigrate to freedom in the West. The Foreign Office revealed in confidence to the State Department its fear that Hitler might permit a mass exodus. If approaches to Germany to release Jews were pressed too much, that is exactly what might happen. No less callous to the plight of the Jews, 2 months later, Pope Pius XII wrote an urgent letter to President Roosevelt to persuade him that Jews should not be allowed to return to Palestine. We are able to provide only a small amount of the documentation to demonstrate the crime of anti-Semitism and the fact that the whole world is guilty. This should be enough, however, to reveal the horror of this evil that is still with us and is becoming uglier. There is no escaping the fact that this is exactly what the Bible foretold. Just on the basis of prophesied anti-Semitism alone, we have sufficient proof that the God of Israel exists and that the Bible is His infallible word. A rising tide of Jew hatred today. Anti-Semitism did not end with the defeat of Nazi Germany and the death of Hitler. In fulfillment of biblical prophecies, not only in Muslim countries but worldwide, it is again on the rise, causing a heightened level of alert in Jewish communities. A brief search of the Internet reveals scores of examples. There is an alarming increase in the widespread desecration of Jewish cemeteries. Violence against Jews and Jewish property is rising. In Istanbul, Turkey, in the middle of the fast of Ramadan, a time of peace for Arab tribes prior to Islam, car bombs devastated 2 synagogues, killing or wounding dozens. In Morocco, in May 2004, terrorists hit a Jewish community center and hotel, leaving a trail of death. Other incidents are too numerous to mention. In polls across the EU, most Europeans continue to rate Israel as the greatest obstacle to peace in the world, ahead of the United States, which places second. The EU has repeatedly condemned Israel for using force against Palestinian terrorists who attack her, killing and maiming thousands of innocent women and children. Yet they never condemned the terrorists and have been supporting the Palestinians at the rate of 500,000 euros a month, much of which has been used to fund terrorism against Israel. Apparently, Israel is expected to fight terrorism nonviolently, like we are doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Jewish synagogue in Vienna, Austria, has suffered attacks in the past. As others throughout Europe, it must be guarded by heavily armed police 24 hours a day. Abraham Foxman, National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, recently wrote, quote, "I am convinced that we currently face as great a threat to the safety and security of the Jewish people as the one we faced in the 1930s, if not a greater one." End of quote. Violent acts against Jews have risen to an alarming level in France, which has a Jewish population of about 600,000, surrounded by 6 million Muslims worshiping in 1,500 mosques. As a result, record numbers of Jews are leaving France for Israel. The rising tide of anti-Semitism in Germany brought more than 4,000 Christians from all over the country to stage a protest demonstration in front of the Reichstag in Berlin in August 2002. A poll by Germany's University of Bielefeld early in December 2004 revealed that 51% of Germans believe that Israel's present-day treatment of the Palestinians is similar to what the Nazis did to the Jews during World War II. The survey also found that 68% of Germans believe that Israel is waging a war of extermination against the Palestinians. How could they get it exactly backwards? Anti-Semitism, prophesied in the Bible, blinds to the truth. Even in Israel, anti-Semitism is on the rise. According to the Information Center for Victims of Anti-Semitism in Israel, there have been some 500 such incidents in Israel during the past 3 years. The Russian-language newspapers in Israel print a story on an anti-Semitic incident every week. And at every police station in the country, at least one anti-Semitic case is registered, says Zalman Galinsky, director of the Information Center. Harvard University's president, Lawrence H. Summers, recently condemned what he termed growing anti-Semitism at Harvard and elsewhere. Nearly 600 professors, students, staff members, and alumni from Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology signed a petition urging Harvard and MIT to divest from Israel. Similar efforts have been mounted at about 40 other universities. The Presbyterian Church USA, it had a Palestinian president in 2002, is leading a campaign to pressure Caterpillar, Motorola, ITT Industries, and United Technologies to cease sales of military equipment and supplies to Israel under the threat of churches divesting themselves of their stock. A similar campaign of divestiture was successfully waged by American churches during the 1980s to pressure South Africa to end apartheid. The reason for anti-Semitism. According to the Bible, there are two reasons for this universal hatred of Jews and Israel. First of all, the Jews, as God's chosen people, are under His judgment for their rebellion against Him and the rejection of their Messiah. Secondly, anti-Semitism is inspired of Satan, a being whose existence many educated people deny. The reason is obvious. It was foretold that the Savior of the world, who would rescue mankind from Satan's control, would be a Jew. Satan's only hope to escape eternal doom, therefore, was to destroy those whom God chose to be a special people unto Himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. Had Satan been able to destroy the Jews before the birth of the Messiah, he would have prevented his own defeat. For promising a Messiah who never came, God would have proved Himself a liar and lost any moral ground for punishing Satan. The Bible declares that the Messiah came and defeated Satan by tasting death for every man and bearing our sins in His own body on the tree. But that fact did not end the battle between God and His arch-enemy for the hearts, minds, and eternal destiny of mankind. That battle continues to rage, and Israel is at its center. The Bible contains hundreds of prophecies that, although God would severely punish Israel for her sins, He would preserve a remnant and bring the scattered Jews back into their own land. This prophecy, too, is undeniably in the process of being fulfilled in our day. Satan could still escape his eternal doom if he could wipe out Israel. That fact provides the only rational explanation for Muslims' irrational obsession with destroying that tiny nation. It also stands as evidence that Satan is a reality, not a myth. Establishment of the State of Israel. Nothing aroused Satan's desperate fury and the wrath of Islam as did the birth of the nation of Israel. It must be annihilated. And to this end, the driving force is not a few extremists, but Islam itself. Islam promises Muslims victory against the Jews as well as against the entire world. Instead, they taste only humiliation in every attack they launch. Israel, on the other hand, in spite of being under God's judgment, enjoys His protection in many ways, as we have already seen. Quote, "In that day will I make the governors of Judah like a torch of fire in a sheaf, and they shall devour all the people round about." The wars of 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973 have borne eloquent testimony to the truth of Scripture. Quote, "If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, now may Israel say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side when men rose up against us, then they had swallowed us up quick, when their wrath was kindled against us. Blessed be the Lord, who hath not given us as a prey to their teeth. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth." End quote. The Arabs' repeated defeat at the hands of Israel is both embarrassing and maddening for them. The Imams blame this shame upon the departure from true Islam by the masses of Muslims. They are whipping up a worldwide revival of fundamentalist Islam as the way to regain Allah's blessing and thereby defeat Israel. As long as Israel retains autonomy over 1 square yard of land, it is an affront to Islam and declares to the world that Islam is a false religion, Allah a false God, Muhammad a false prophet, and the Quran a false revelation. This is the issue, and all the talk of peace without recognizing and changing this teaching of Islam is both a fool's dream and a fraud. It has well been said, if Arabs, Muslims put down their weapons today, that would be the end of Arab-Israeli wars. If Israel put down her weapons, that would be the end of Israel. These are simple facts that no one can deny and are worth thinking about very seriously. Another amazing prophecy. Balaam is one of the most enigmatic figures in the Bible. He was at one time in touch with God and made some genuine prophecies as recorded in Scripture. Yet, he later turned away from God and is in hell now. For example, he foretold the star in the east that the wise men saw and followed to find Christ at his birth. One of Balaam's prophecies recorded in the Bible that has been and is still being fulfilled in our day is most unusual. He declared that Israel would not be reckoned among the nations. This remarkable utterance does not stand alone. God has stated it many times and in other ways. For example, quote, "The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. I am the Lord your God, which have separated you from other people. I, the Lord, am holy, and have severed you from other people that ye should be mine." End of quote. Except for the holiness it was to manifest, this is precisely the situation in which Israel finds herself today. Israel has been a member of the United Nations for more than 50 years. Yet she is not allowed to take her 2-year turn as one of the 10 rotating nations, joining the 5 permanent ones on the UN Security Council. Of the 191 current UN members, 190, including the worst terrorist nations, are allowed to take their turns on the Security Council, but not Israel. Nor is Israel, as already noted, allowed to take a rotating term on the 53-member UN Commission on Human Rights. All of the other 190 UN member nations are allowed to do so. These have included Libya, Cuba, Zimbabwe, and other egregious violators of human rights. Incredibly, Sudan, where more than 2 million blacks in the South have been slaughtered by Muslims, has been voted in for a 3rd consecutive term. But Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, is excluded, as the Bible foretold. This watchdog commission, UNHRC, has never found anything questionable or to be criticized in the deplorable human rights record of some of the worst violators, such as Libya, Saudi Arabia, or Syria. Yet, Israel is continually condemned by the UNHRC, more than 100 times in the past 2 years. Far from denouncing suicide bombers, it upholds Palestinian rights to take any kind of retaliatory action against Israeli aggression. Nor is Israel allowed to be a member of the International Red Cross. The Red Crescent, representing Muslim countries, among which are many terrorist nations, is part of this international humanitarian organization. But Israel, which signed the 1949 Geneva Conventions, many of the members of the Red Crescent did not, is barred from the International Red Cross. As we have noted, Whether the rest of the world likes it or not, the Jews are God's chosen people. That fact carries not only blessings and privileges, but also responsibilities and penalties for disobedience. Israel has experienced both God's blessing and judgment in the past. Both testify to the integrity of God and His Word. Israel remains in His hands and under His protection today, even while she is at the same time experiencing His discipline. God must fulfill His word concerning judgment, as well as the prophesied full restoration and eternal blessing for the remnant that survives Armageddon. Woe to those who oppose God's promises to Israel. 10 lost tribes? There are other ways to get rid of the Jews than putting them into Hitler's ovens or killing them by Muslim terrorism and war. There is the myth of the 10 lost tribes that is popularly believed among Christians today. Yes, the 10 northern tribes were indeed carried into Assyria in about 740 B.C. Quote, "Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of His sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah, as He had said by all His servants the prophets. So was Israel carried away out of their land to Assyria until this day." End of quote. Of course, this day refers to the day in which this was written, not to our day. Furthermore, it is clear that many, if not most of those who were carried away had returned, even at that time. There is specific mention of a multitude of the people, even many of Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun, who escaped out of the hands of the king of Assyria, and kept the Passover in Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah, more than a decade after the carrying away into Assyria. Then we read of Israel joining with Judah in keeping the Passover during the great revival under King Josiah, about 90 years later. 7 of the 10 lost tribes are mentioned as being present, and the implication is that all were there. Nearly 200 years after the 10 tribes were carried into Assyria, God gave Ezekiel a vision of the future restoration and referred to the promised land being divided according to the 12 tribes of Israel. If 10 tribes were lost, Christ's promise could not be fulfilled to His disciples. Quote, "When the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of His glory, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." End quote. Then Christ would be a liar and Satan the victor. Paul didn't think any tribes were lost. In his appeal to King Agrippa, he refers to the 12 tribes as in existence at that time. James addressed his epistle to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Yet the myth of the 10 lost tribes is still believed by many Christians. More anti-Semitism among Christians. Another idea gaining popularity among Christians today is the false teaching that the church has replaced Israel. This Roman Catholic doctrine, which is a form of anti-Semitism, is also promoted by evangelicals. It declares that Israel has been cut off because of her sins, and the prophecies concerning her restoration are no longer valid. If that were so, then the everlasting covenant promised to Israel 11 times in the Old Testament and the everlasting possession of the land promised twice were not everlasting at all, and God has lied. Again, Satan has won, and this world belongs to him. There are scores of promises that God would in the end restore Israel fully to her land. Yet Christian leaders deny these promises by saying that Israel is finished. Quote, "Physical Jews are in slavery and will not be heirs of God's promise because they are not the children of promise." End quote. Another author writes, quote, "The idea that corporate national Israel is still God's chosen people is prevalent in the minds of many today. But the Word of God shows that Israel broke the Old Covenant and thereby forfeited any rights to it. End of quote. This claim, if true, would clearly make God a liar. We will deal with this more fully in chapter 11, proving that it is false. World Vision is the largest and one of the oldest, founded in 1950, independent evangelical charitable organizations in the world, with annual income exceeding $1.2 billion. It claims to use its resources for emergency relief, education, health care, economic development, and promotion of justice. Of the millions of dollars it allocates to the Middle East, nothing goes to Israelis. Everything goes to Palestinians. All of the wars Arabs have started from 1948 to the present, and all of the Muslim terrorism is blamed upon Israel. World Vision calls security measures that Israel takes to protect its citizens from Muslim attacks collective punishment against Palestinians. Terrorists are the victims, not those they murder in cold blood. The anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian bias exhibited by Christian organizations is staggering, not only in its wickedness, but also in the misinformation it persuades supporters to believe. Christian Aid Mission promotes some of the worst anti-Israel propaganda. The Holocaust killed 600,000, not 6 million. It is not the Arabs who are terrorists, but the Jews. Ashkenazi Zionists are not Jews but Khazars, who, through acts of terrorism, have killed, driven out, or displaced over 2 million of the original residents of Palestine. The fact that such claims are false will be fully documented herein. Why did God choose Israel? He had to choose a people through whom the Messiah would come into the world as a man to pay the penalty for our sins. It was not a matter of favoritism, but selection of someone named Abraham who, like Noah, found grace in his eyes and would be obedient to him. He is given the amazing designation in the Bible as the friend of God. Abraham was promised a land that would be an everlasting possession for his heirs. The present conflict in the Middle East involves the question of who those heirs are today. We will turn to that issue next. Please visit our website, thebereancall.org, to access our radio archives going back to 1999 and our newsletter going back to 1986. We offer daily updates by email or visit us on Facebook or Twitter. Are you looking for information about a specific topic? Go to thebereancall.org and click on Topics at the top of the page. Our online store is thebereancall.com. We offer a wide variety of books, tracts, CDs, and DVDs. Note that most of our ebooks are free. I'm Gary Carmichael. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you can join us again next week. Until then, we encourage you to search the Scriptures 24/7.
Though none go with me, I still will follow. No turning back, no turning back.